June 1943, Port of Norfolk, Virginia. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the American coastline approach through the early morning mist. Around him, 300 German prisoners of war from Rommel's Afrika Korps stood in silence, their faces reflecting exhaustion, defeat, and uncertainty about what awaited them in enemy territory. Weber had been a committed National Socialist for a decade, had believed absolutely in German superiority and the inevitable triumph of the Third Reich. He had fought across North Africa, had seen his men die in the desert, had finally been captured when the Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia 2 months earlier. Now he was being transported to imprisonment in America, the nation that Nazi propaganda had portrayed as weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. As the ship entered Norfolk Harbor, Weber expected to see a nation struggling under the strains of war. Germany in 1943 was under total mobilization, with severe rationing, darkened cities, factories running on minimal resources. Britain, which Weber had seen briefly during transit, showed obvious signs of wartime privation. Bombed buildings, tight rationing, exhausted civilians. America should be worse, he thought. The United States had been at war for 18 months, was fighting on 2 fronts, was supposedly stretched to breaking point. The harbor should show signs of strain, of resources depleted, of a nation barely managing the war effort. What Friedrich Weber saw instead was beyond his comprehension. Norfolk Harbor was more active than any port he had ever seen, including Hamburg or Rotterdam before the war. Dozens of ships were being loaded simultaneously. Massive cranes moved cargo with mechanical efficiency. Liberty ships, the mass-produced freighters that Nazi propagandists had mocked as primitive, were being loaded with equipment and supplies in quantities that seemed impossible. Weber watched as one Liberty ship was loaded with trucks. Not a few trucks, not a careful allocation of scarce resources, but hundreds of trucks, identical vehicles rolling off production lines in quantities that suggested they were as common as bicycles. In Germany, every truck was precious, carefully maintained, irreplaceable. Here, trucks were being loaded by the hundreds onto a single ship, apparently considered so plentiful they could be shipped overseas by the thousands. The prisoner transport docked, and German POWs were marched off the ship onto American soil. Weber expected harsh treatment. He had been told that Americans, especially American soldiers of German descent, would be brutal toward captured Germans. Instead, the American guards were professional but not cruel, efficient but not vindictive. They processed prisoners with bureaucratic thoroughness, issued them prison uniforms, provided them with more food than they had seen in months. The food shocked Weber almost as much as the harbor activity. The meal provided to prisoners that first day included meat, fresh bread, vegetables, fruit, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes Germans had been drinking since 1941. The portions were larger than what German soldiers received as rations. These were enemy prisoners being fed better than soldiers of the Reich. One of Weber's men, a corporal named Hans Becker, whispered to him in disbelief, "Herr Hauptmann, this must be propaganda, yes? They feed us well the first day to impress us, then the rations will decrease?" Weber had thought the same thing. It had to be a show, an attempt to impress prisoners before conditions reverted to what they expected: minimal rations, harsh treatment, the privations of war. But as Weber would discover over the following months and years of captivity, this abundance wasn't a show. It was simply how America operated, even in wartime. And that realization would shatter everything he had believed about German superiority and American weakness. This is the story of how 371,683 German prisoners of war experienced a psychological transformation during their captivity in America from 1943 to 1946. The story of how men who had been raised under Nazi ideology, who had fought for the Third Reich, who had believed absolutely in German superiority, encountered an industrial and agricultural system so vastly superior to their own that their entire worldview collapsed. This is the story of the greatest re-education program in history, one that didn't rely on propaganda or coercion, but on the simple, undeniable evidence of American abundance. The story of how America won a crucial victory not through combat but through production, not by destroying enemy soldiers but by showing them a better way of life, not through force, but through example. This is the story of how the arsenal of democracy defeated Nazi ideology by demonstrating that free societies could outproduce, outbuild, and outperform totalitarian systems so completely that the comparison became absurd. And how that demonstration, experienced by hundreds of thousands of German POWs who would return to Germany after the war, helped create the foundation for democratic reconstruction and the German economic miracle that followed. The American POW program for German prisoners was the largest such operation in U.S. history. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German prisoners were held in more than 500 camps scattered across the United States. These weren't concentration camps or even harsh military prisons. They were detention facilities designed to hold prisoners securely while treating them according to the Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner welfare. The program began in 1943 when large numbers of German prisoners from the North African campaign needed to be housed somewhere. Britain was already holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners and couldn't accommodate more. Transporting prisoners to Canada was possible but limited. The United States, with vast space and resources, was the logical choice for housing prisoners taken in North Africa and later in Europe. The first German POWs arrived in America in 1943, mostly Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia. These were experienced soldiers, many of them hardened by years of combat, thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. They expected imprisonment in America to be harsh, possibly brutal. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans, especially those of German heritage who had betrayed the fatherland, would treat German prisoners with special cruelty. What they encountered instead was a detention system that, while certainly restrictive, provided living conditions superior to what many had experienced as soldiers in the German military. POW camps were built across America, from the Deep South to the Northern Plains, from California to New York. Prisoners were housed in barracks, provided with adequate food and medical care, allowed to work for wages, and given recreational opportunities. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be housed in conditions comparable to those of the detaining power's own soldiers. American compliance with this requirement meant that German prisoners lived better than they had as German soldiers, because American soldiers in 1943-1946 lived better than soldiers of any other nation in history. But the real shock to German prisoners wasn't the camp conditions themselves. It was what they saw of America beyond the camps. Prisoners worked on American farms, in American factories, on construction projects across the country. They interacted with American civilians, observed American life, and saw firsthand the industrial and agricultural abundance that made America the arsenal of democracy. Friedrich Weber, the Afrika Korps captain who watched Norfolk Harbor in 1943, was sent to a POW camp in Kansas. The camp itself was unremarkable: barracks, fence, guard towers, the expected infrastructure of a detention facility. But the location was revealing. The camp was situated near agricultural land, and prisoners could see American farming operations from the camp. Weber had grown up on a farm in Bavaria. He understood agriculture, knew what good farmland looked like, knew the economics of farming. What he saw in Kansas was beyond anything he had imagined possible. The farms were vast, larger than entire German villages. A single farm might encompass thousands of acres, worked with machinery that German farmers couldn't afford or even obtain. Tractors, harvesters, and equipment that in Germany would be shared among dozens of farms or operated by agricultural cooperatives were here owned by individual farmers. The productivity was staggering. Weber watched American farms produce wheat yields that exceeded German averages by 50% or more. He saw one farmer, working with his family and perhaps a hired hand or two, plus German POW labor, cultivating more land and producing more crops than a German farming. Village of 100 families. The explanation was obvious: mechanization. American farms were mechanized to a degree that German agriculture couldn't match. Tractors were common rather than rare. Harvesting equipment that in Germany would be cutting-edge technology available only to the largest estates was here standard equipment for medium-sized farms. But the deeper revelation was about economic systems. These highly mechanized, highly productive farms weren't state enterprises or collective farms. They were private operations, owned by individual families, operating in a free market economy. The capitalist system that Nazi ideology condemned as inefficient and parasitic was producing agricultural output that exceeded Socialist Germany's planned economy by enormous margins. Weber began keeping a diary, writing observations he initially intended to use for intelligence purposes if he ever escaped or was repatriated. The diary entries from his first months in Kansas reveal his growing confusion and cognitive dissonance. July 15, 1943. Work today on farm belonging to American named Morrison. The man owns 2,400 acres, cultivates it with 3 tractors and various equipment. He employs no permanent workers beyond his 2 sons, uses us prisoners during harvest season. The farm produces more wheat than my entire village district in Bavaria. How is this possible? We were told American agriculture was backward, inefficient. What I see suggests otherwise. August 3, 1943. The food continues to be excellent, better than what we received as soldiers. When I commented on this to an American guard, he laughed and said the camp food was nothing special, just standard rations. If this is standard, what do Americans normally eat? The guard showed me a Sears catalog, pointed out food items available for purchase. The variety and abundance shown in the catalog exceeded anything available in Germany even before the war. September 12, 1943. Taken to nearby town for medical treatment. The town, population perhaps 3,000, appeared prosperous despite the war. Shops were open, goods were available, people seemed well-fed and well-dressed. I saw no signs of privation or rationing comparable to Germany. Are we seeing only wealthy areas? But the guard said this was a typical small town, nothing special. If this is typical, what does that say about American wealth? Weber's diary reveals the psychological process that many German POWs experienced. Initial assumption that what they were seeing was propaganda or anomaly, followed by gradual realization that American abundance was real and normal, followed by fundamental questioning of Nazi ideology that had taught German superiority. The cognitive dissonance was severe. Everything Weber had been taught, everything he had believed about the relative strength of Germany versus America, was being contradicted by direct observation. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as weak, racially degenerate, industrially backward, on the verge of economic collapse. The reality was a nation producing war materials at a rate that exceeded all Axis powers combined, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards higher than Germany achieved in peacetime. How could both things be true? How could Nazi ideology be correct about German superiority while America demonstrated such obvious superiority in production, technology, and living standards? The contradiction couldn't be resolved without abandoning core Nazi beliefs. And for many German POWs, the evidence of their own eyes eventually outweighed the propaganda they had been taught. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Many prisoners, especially hardcore Nazis and SS members, rejected what they saw, insisted it was elaborate deception, clung to ideology despite contradictory evidence. But for ordinary German soldiers, for men like Friedrich Weber who had fought for their country without necessarily being ideological fanatics, the cumulative weight of evidence became impossible to deny. The American military understood that this exposure to American life was having psychological effects on German prisoners. In 1944, the War Department established a formal re-education program for German POWs designed to prepare them for eventual return to Germany as supporters of democracy rather than Nazism. The program, known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, provided prisoners with access to books, newspapers, films, and educational materials that presented democratic values and accurate information about the war. Prisoners could take courses, attend lectures, and participate in discussions about politics, economics, and society. But the formal re-education program was less important than the informal education prisoners received simply by living in America and observing American life. No propaganda film could match the impact of seeing American industrial production firsthand. No lecture about democracy could compete with interacting with American civilians and seeing how free societies functioned. The American strategy, whether deliberate or accidental, was brilliant. Instead of trying to convince German prisoners through argument that democracy was superior to fascism, America simply showed them the results. Instead of debating ideology, America demonstrated outcomes. The message wasn't, "You should believe in democracy." It was, "Look at what democracy produces." And what democracy produced in 1943 and 1946, America was staggering. The United States was engaged in a two-front war against Germany and Japan simultaneously. It was supplying allies in Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and elsewhere with equipment and supplies. It was building the largest military force in American history, equipping millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And while doing all of this, while fighting the largest war in human history, America was also maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded what most nations achieved in peacetime. American civilians in 1943 lived better than German civilians in 1939. American workers had higher incomes, better housing, more consumer goods, and greater personal freedom than their German counterparts had enjoyed even before the war began. For German POWs observing this, the implications were devastating to Nazi ideology. They had been taught that total mobilization, that sacrificing everything for the war effort, was necessary and proved German superiority. But America was winning the war without total mobilization, was outproducing Germany without the sacrifices Germans had been told were essential. The question became unavoidable. If America could fight a global war while maintaining high civilian living standards, while preserving personal freedoms, while operating a market economy, what did that say about the efficiency of totalitarian systems? What did it say about the necessity of the sacrifices Germans had been told to make? Weber's diary from late 1943 reveals his struggling with these questions. October 28, 1943, conversation today with American Guard, a sergeant from Wisconsin. He mentioned casually that his family farm, run now by his father and younger brother while he serves in the Army, produces dairy products for the war effort. He seemed to consider this unremarkable. But the scale he described, 600 cows, mechanized milking, production levels that would supply a German city, this was presented as a typical family farm operation. I begin to understand why America can supply Britain and Russia while also feeding its own people in military. The scale of production is beyond what we imagined. November 15, 1943, showed American magazine to several comrades. The magazine, called Life, contained photographs of American factories, homes, and daily life. Some prisoners insisted the photographs were propaganda, staged scenes designed to impress us. But I have now been in America for 5 months, have seen enough to know the photographs are genuine. This is how Americans actually live. The implications are troubling to contemplate. December 3, 1943, discussion tonight among prisoners about when Germany will win the war. I said nothing, but privately I no longer believe Germany can win. The disparity in production is too great. America produces in a month what Germany produces in a year. How can we win against such odds? But to say this aloud would be defeatism, possibly treason. I keep my doubts private. Weber's diary entries reveal the isolation that German POWs who began questioning Nazi ideology felt. The camps contained many hardcore Nazis who enforced ideological conformity among prisoners, sometimes violently. Prisoners who openly doubted German victory or criticized Nazi ideology risked being beaten or killed by fellow prisoners. The American military recognized this problem and began segregating prisoners based on their political attitudes. Hardcore Nazis were separated from those who showed willingness to accept re-education. This segregation was imperfect, but helped create environments where prisoners could question Nazi ideology without fearing violence from fellow POWs. By 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, the psychological transformation of German POWs accelerated. News of Allied victories, of Germany's deteriorating position, combined with daily observation of American abundance to create cumulative pressure on prisoners' belief systems. The formal re-education program intensified in 1944. The program was run by American officers, many of them German immigrants who had fled Nazi persecution, who understood German culture and psychology. They created newspapers, Der Ruf, The Call, written by screened German POWs for distribution in camps. The newspaper presented accurate war news, democratic political philosophy, and criticism of Nazi ideology. Prisoners were offered courses in American history, government, and economics. Those who participated and showed genuine acceptance of democratic values were treated better, given more privileges, prepared for eventual return to Germany as supporters of democracy. But the formal program remained less important than the informal education provided by American life itself. German POWs working on American farms saw agricultural productivity that exceeded German capabilities. Those working in factories saw industrial production that made German industry look primitive. Those interacting with American civilians saw a society that was freer, wealthier, and more dynamic than Nazi Germany had ever been. The cumulative effect was devastating to Nazi ideology. German prisoners had been taught that Aryan Germans were superior to the mongrel Americans. They had been taught that authoritarian government was more efficient than democracy. They had been taught that Germany's economic system was superior to American capitalism. Every day of captivity in America provided evidence contradicting these teachings. The master race was imprisoned by supposed inferiors who lived better, produced more, and were winning the war decisively. The efficient authoritarian state was being outproduced by a chaotic democracy. The superior German economic system was being overwhelmed by American capitalism's abundance. For some prisoners, this cognitive dissonance was unbearable. They clung to Nazi ideology despite contradictory evidence, insisted that what they saw was deception or anomaly, maintained their beliefs through denial of reality. But for many others, the weight of evidence eventually forced acceptance of uncomfortable truths. Friedrich Weber's transformation can be traced through his diary entries. By early 1945, his writing had shifted from defending Nazi ideology to questioning it, to finally rejecting it. January 20th, 1945, learned today that my hometown was bombed by Americans. My first reaction was hatred, desire for revenge. But then I thought about what I have seen here, about American production capacity, about the war's trajectory. Germany cannot win. Every day the war continues means more German cities destroyed, more German soldiers killed. Is it defeatism to want the war to end, or is it realism to recognize inevitable defeat and hope for minimal destruction in the process? February 14, 1945. Attended lecture today on American government system. The lecturer, a German immigrant who fled in 1938, explained constitutional democracy, separation of powers, protection of individual rights. I initially dismissed this as propaganda, but reflecting on it, I realized I have seen these principles in practice. American guards follow rules, can be held accountable for misconduct. Prisoners have rights that are respected. This is different from what I knew in Germany, where power was arbitrary and unchecked. March 30th, 1945, heard news that American forces have crossed the Rhine, that Germany's situation is hopeless. Some prisoners still insist on ultimate German victory through wonder weapons or miracles. I no longer believe this. Germany will lose because we were outproduced, outmanned, and outthought by enemies we had dismissed as inferior. The question now is what happens after defeat? Can Germany rebuild? Can we learn from this experience? Weber's final question, could Germany learn from defeat, was precisely what the American re-education program aimed to achieve. The goal wasn't just to change individual prisoners' minds, but to create a cadre of Germans who would return home after the war as advocates for democracy, who would help rebuild Germany as a democratic nation allied with the West rather than as a resentful defeated power seeking revenge. The strategy was based on American experiences after World War I, when harsh treatment of defeated Germany created resentment that contributed to the rise of Nazism. American planners in World War II were determined to avoid repeating that mistake. Instead of punishing defeated Germans, America would demonstrate to them that democracy and capitalism produced better results than fascism and state control. The POW program was central to this strategy. Every German prisoner who returned home with favorable impressions of America, with understanding of how democracy functioned, with acceptance that German aggression had been wrong and defeat was deserved, was a seed for democratic reconstruction. By mid-1945, when Germany surrendered, the transformation of many German POWs was well advanced. Not all prisoners had changed their views. Hardcore Nazis remained resistant to evidence and argument. But a significant percentage of the 371 German prisoners held in America had experienced genuine psychological transformation, had come to question or reject Nazi ideology, had developed at least grudging respect for American society and democratic values. The psychological transformation of German POWs in America reached its peak in the final year of the war and the period immediately after Germany's surrender in May 1945. With the war over and Nazi Germany destroyed, prisoners could no longer cling to hopes of ultimate German victory or rationalizations that temporary setbacks would be reversed. The reality was undeniable. Germany had been defeated utterly, and the American system that Nazi ideology had dismissed as weak and decadent had proven overwhelmingly superior. The period from May 1945 to the final repatriations in 1946 saw the most intensive phase of the formal re-education program. With the war over, prisoners no longer had military duties or hopes of escape. They were simply waiting to go home to a Germany that had been destroyed, occupied, and divided. This liminal period, where their old life was gone but their new life hadn't yet begun, created psychological openness to transformation. Friedrich Weber's diary entries from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his past beliefs with present reality, trying to understand how everything he had believed turned out to be wrong, and attempting to envision what kind of future Germany might have. May 15, 1945. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. We have lost everything. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years lasted 12. The German army that was supposed to be invincible was crushed. Everything we fought for is gone. I should feel despair, but instead I feel something like relief. The madness is over. Perhaps now we can rebuild something better from the ruins. June 3, 1945. Attended screening for re-education program today. American officers asked questions about our political beliefs, our understanding of why Germany lost, our thoughts about Germany's future. I answered honestly, said that I had come to believe Nazi ideology was fundamentally wrong, that Germany's aggression was criminal, that we deserved defeat. Some prisoners in line with me sneered, called me a traitor under their breath, but I no longer care. I've seen too much here to pretend Nazi beliefs were correct. July 20th, 1945. Remarkable coincidence. Today is anniversary of the July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler. At the time, I thought the conspirators were traitors. Now I believe they were heroes who tried to save Germany from complete destruction. If they had succeeded, how many lives would have been saved? How much of Germany would still be standing? The real traitors were Hitler and the Nazis who led Germany to ruin while claiming to make it great. Weber's transformation was replicated with variations across hundreds of thousands of German POWs. Not all changed as completely. Some maintained Nazi beliefs or simply became apolitical, wanting only to survive and go home. But a substantial portion experienced genuine ideological transformation, coming to reject Nazism and accept democratic values. The mechanisms of this transformation were multiple and reinforcing. Direct observation of American abundance was primary. Prisoners saw with their own eyes the productivity, wealth, and freedom that democracy and capitalism produced. But other factors contributed as well. News of Nazi atrocities, as concentration camps were liberated and the full horror of the Holocaust became known, shocked many prisoners. Nazi propaganda had hidden these crimes from ordinary Germans. Many soldiers genuinely hadn't known about systematic extermination. Learning about it after the war created cognitive crisis. How could the regime they had served have committed such crimes? How could the ideology they had believed in have produced such evil? American re-education efforts systematically exposed German POWs to documentation of Nazi crimes. Films of concentration camp liberations were shown to prisoners. Photographs of atrocities were displayed. Survivor testimonies were presented. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Some prisoners responded with denial, insisting the evidence was fabricated, Allied propaganda designed to justify harsh treatment of Germany. But many others, confronted with irrefutable documentation, experienced profound moral reckoning. They had served a regime that committed genocide, had fought for a cause that was not just defeated but morally abhorrent. Weber's diary from August 1945 reveals his response to learning about the Holocaust. August 12, 1945, shown film today of Buchenwald concentration camp liberation. I cannot describe what I saw. The skeletal prisoners, the piles of bodies, the systematic machinery of death. I wanted to deny it, to insist it was propaganda, but the evidence is too overwhelming. This happened. The regime I served did this. I feel physically ill. How did we not know? How did I not know? Or did I choose not to see what was happening? August 15, 1945. Cannot stop thinking about the camp films. Discussion among prisoners. Some still deny the evidence is real, call it Allied fabrication. Others, like me, are struggling to comprehend how this was possible. One prisoner said the Jews must have deserved it somehow. I wanted to strike him. Nothing justifies what was done. Nothing. I served a regime that committed mass murder. How do I live with that knowledge? August 22, 1945. Spoke with American officer, a Jew whose family escaped Germany in 1936. He listened to my expressions of guilt and shame, then said something surprising. You personally are not responsible for crimes you didn't commit and didn't know about, but you are responsible for what you do now with this knowledge. Will you help build a better Germany, or will you cling to the ideology that produced these horrors? I told him I want to help build something better. He said that's all anyone can ask. The exposure to Nazi atrocities, combined with observation of American abundance and democratic functioning, created powerful impetus for ideological transformation. Prisoners could see clearly that Nazi ideology had produced both military defeat and moral catastrophe, while democratic capitalism had produced victory and maintained moral principles even in war. The contrast was stark and undeniable. American forces liberating concentration camps exemplified the difference between the systems. American soldiers, representing a democratic society, were horrified by what they found in the camps, were motivated to document and punish these crimes. The Nazi regime had treated mass murder as policy, had industrialized genocide, had made atrocity systematic. For German POWs wrestling with these revelations, the implications were clear. The ideology they had believed in wasn't just wrong strategically or economically. It was wrong morally, had produced evil on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Rejecting Nazism wasn't just pragmatic recognition of defeat. It was moral necessity. The American re-education program leveraged these psychological dynamics deliberately. Prisoners were shown that democracy wasn't just more productive than fascism, but more moral. American treatment of prisoners, despite justified anger at German crimes, remained within legal and ethical bounds. Americans didn't descend to Nazi methods even when fighting Nazis. This demonstrated that democratic values weren't just propaganda, but genuine principles that constrained behavior even toward enemies. By late 1945, the formal re-education program had crystallized into a systematic curriculum. Prisoners who showed willingness to engage were offered courses in democratic governance and constitutional principles, free market economics, and capitalism. German history, particularly the rise and fall of Nazism. American history and social development. The Holocaust and Nazi crimes. Plans for democratic reconstruction of Germany. The courses were taught by American officers, German immigrants, and carefully screened German POWs who had already undergone transformation and could speak to their fellow prisoners as peers rather than as enemy lecturers. Prisoners who completed the curriculum and demonstrated genuine acceptance of democratic values were designated as graduates of the program, received certificates, and were promised consideration for early repatriation and potential positions in occupied Germany's reconstruction efforts. The program graduated thousands of German POWs who returned to Germany explicitly prepared to support democratic reconstruction. These men became teachers, local government officials, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who advocated for democracy in their communities. They were seeds planted in German soil, intended to grow into democratic culture. But beyond the formal graduates, hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners returned to Germany with at least some exposure to American values and some erosion of their Nazi beliefs. Even prisoners who hadn't formally participated in re-education had lived in America, had observed American life, had experienced treatment far better than Nazi propaganda predicted. These experiences created openness to democratic ideas that formal re-education could build on. The practical details of what German POWs experienced in America deserve close examination because the specific observations prisoners made shaped their psychological transformation. The cumulative weight of many small observations, more than any single dramatic revelation, changed minds. German prisoners working in American factories observed industrial practices that explained American production superiority. The factories operated with methods that maximized efficiency and worker productivity. Assembly line production, standardization of parts, mechanization of repetitive tasks, all of these techniques were more advanced in American factories than in German industry. But more striking than the techniques was the scale. American factories were simply larger than comparable German facilities, employed more workers, ran more shifts, produced more output. A single American aircraft factory might employ 40,000 workers and produce hundreds of aircraft per month. German aircraft factories, by comparison, were smaller operations producing dozens of aircraft per month with similar numbers of workers. The difference was partly technological. American factories had more advanced machinery, but it was also systemic. American industry operated within a capitalist framework that rewarded efficiency and innovation. German industry, increasingly controlled by the Nazi state after 1936, operated under political control that prioritized ideological goals over economic efficiency. German POWs working at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford produced B-24 Liberator bombers, witnessed industrial production that exceeded anything in Germany. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. The plant employed over 40,000 workers and produced 8,685 aircraft during the war. One German prisoner, a former aircraft mechanic named Josef Dietrich, kept notes on what he observed at Willow Run. His notes, preserved in archives, reveal his astonishment. The factory is over 3 million square feet under one roof, larger than several German aircraft factories combined. The assembly line moves continuously. Parts arrive at one end, completed aircraft emerge at the other. The organization is extraordinary. Every worker knows exactly what to do. Every part arrives exactly when needed. There is no wasted motion, no confusion, no delay. In Germany, we prided ourselves on engineering precision, but we never achieved this level of systematic efficiency. Dietrich's notes continue with observations about American workers. The workers are well paid, earn wages that would be considered excellent in Germany. They work 8-hour shifts, have lunch breaks, are not overworked to exhaustion. In Germany, we were told that workers must sacrifice for the war effort, must work longer hours for lower pay. But American workers, working reasonable hours for good wages, produce far more than German. Workers doing forced overtime. Why? Because they are well-fed, well-rested, motivated by fair compensation. The American system understands that worker welfare and productivity are connected, not opposed. These observations about worker treatment illuminated a fundamental difference between American capitalism and Nazi economics. Nazi ideology held that workers should sacrifice individual welfare for collective goals, should accept low wages and harsh conditions as their contribution to national greatness. American capitalism, pragmatically if not ideologically, recognized that well-compensated, well-treated workers were more productive than exploited ones. German prisoners working on American farms observed similar contrasts. American agricultural productivity exceeded German levels, not because American soil was better or climate more favorable, but because American farming was more mechanized, used better techniques, and operated in a market system that rewarded efficiency. A German prisoner named Otto Schneider, who worked on farms in Iowa, wrote letters home after repatriation describing what he had observed. The American farms are large beyond what you can imagine. A single farmer with his family might work 2,000 acres, more land than our entire village district. The equipment is remarkable. Tractors with multiple attachments, combines that harvest and thresh in one operation, trucks that transport crops efficiently. But more important than the equipment is the system. The farmer owns his land, decides what to plant based on market prices, keeps his profits. There is no state planning, no quotas, no officials dictating production. Yet American farms produce more per acre and per worker than German farms with all their planning and control. Schneider's letters highlighted the paradox that Nazi ideology couldn't explain. How could a chaotic, unplanned, individualistic system outperform a rationally planned, collectively organized one? The answer, which Schneider came to accept, was that markets and individual initiative were more effective at coordinating economic activity than central planning, that freedom produced better results than control. Beyond industrial and agricultural observations, German prisoners noticed subtler but equally significant differences in American life. American cities, even during wartime, remained illuminated at night. This was a shock to German prisoners who had lived under blackout conditions for years. The sight of American cities blazing with light at night, while Germany's cities remained dark to avoid bombing, visually demonstrated which side had air superiority and confidence in victory. Prisoners noticed that American civilians had access to consumer goods that had disappeared from German stores years earlier. Clothing, household items, entertainment, all remained available in America despite the war. Rationing existed but was far less severe than in Germany. American civilians complained about rationing, which amused German prisoners who had experienced real privation. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "Americans complain about meat rationing, about having to use ration stamps for butter and sugar, but their rationed amounts exceed what German civilians received even before the war. What Americans consider hardship, we would consider abundance. They don't understand how good they have it." The abundance extended to seemingly trivial but psychologically significant details. American prisoners had access to movies, sports, music, entertainment. POW camps showed films, organized sports leagues, allowed prisoners to form bands and theater groups. This wasn't just humanitarian treatment. It was demonstration that even imprisoned enemies in America lived better than free citizens in Germany. The psychological impact of this observation was profound. If imprisoned enemies lived this well, how did free Americans live? And what did that say about relative national strength and the virtues of different systems? German prisoners interacting with American civilians received additional perspective on American life. Many prisoners worked for farmers or businesses and developed relationships with American employers and co-workers. These relationships, while constrained by the prisoner-civilian divide, provided insights into American attitudes and values. American civilians, prisoners discovered, were generally not vindictive toward German prisoners. There were exceptions. Families who had lost sons in the war sometimes harbored understandable anger toward Germans. But the general attitude was less, "You are evil enemies we hate," and more, "You are soldiers doing your duty, we're glad the war is over, let's get the work done." This pragmatic lack of hatred surprised German prisoners. They had been taught that Americans were bloodthirsty, that capture meant torture or execution, that American society was collapsing into racial and class warfare. Instead, they found a society that was racially diverse but largely stable, that had class differences but also mobility, that fought its enemies fiercely but didn't define itself through hatred. Friedrich Weber's diary from late 1945 recorded conversations with American civilians that shaped his understanding. September 8, 1945. Conversation today with the farmer I work for, Mr. Peterson. He asked about my family in Germany, whether they survived the war. I told him my parents are alive, but my brother was killed on the Eastern Front. Peterson expressed genuine sympathy, said he was sorry for my loss. Then he told me his nephew was killed in France, and he understood what it meant to lose family to war. I was struck by his ability to sympathize with enemy loss while having suffered his own. This is not how I expected Americans to think. October 14, 1945. Peterson invited several of us prisoners to dinner at his home. We were uncertain whether to accept. Was this appropriate? But the guard said it was permitted. The dinner was remarkable. We sat at table with Peterson and his family, ate abundant food, conversed about farming and life. Peterson's wife asked about German cooking, wanted to learn some recipes. His teenage son asked about German cars. He was interested in mechanics and wanted to know about German engineering. They treated us as guests, not as enemies or inferiors. I felt more welcome in this enemy's home than I sometimes felt in homes of fellow Germans under the Nazi system. These personal interactions humanized Americans for German prisoners and humanized Germans for American civilians. Both sides discovered that enemy soldiers were human beings, not monsters, that ordinary people on both sides wanted similar things: peace, prosperity, family, safety. This humanization was crucial to the re-education process. It's easier to maintain ideological hatred when enemies are abstract, when they're propaganda caricatures rather than real people. Personal contact made ideological hatred harder to maintain, created cognitive dissonance between propaganda images and lived experience. By early 1946, as repatriation of German prisoners began, the transformation of many was complete. Not all. Some remained committed Nazis, some were simply broken by defeat and wanted only to survive. Some were indifferent to ideology and focused on practical concerns. But a substantial percentage had experienced genuine psychological change, had come to reject Nazi ideology and accept democratic values. The repatriation process itself was designed to reinforce the lessons learned in captivity. Prisoners being returned to Germany received final orientations on what to expect, on the devastation they would find, on the occupation zones and plans for reconstruction. They were told explicitly that Germany's future depended on accepting democracy and rejecting the nationalism and militarism that had led to catastrophe. Prisoners who had participated in re-education and shown genuine transformation were given certificates and letters of recommendation that might help them find positions in occupied Germany. They were encouraged to become advocates for democracy, to share what they had learned, to help rebuild Germany as a peaceful democratic nation. Friedrich Weber was among those who received such recognition. His diary's final American entry from January 1946 reflected on his transformation. January 12, 1946, tomorrow I return to Germany. I came to America as a Nazi officer, believing in German superiority and American weakness. I return as a different man, having seen that everything I believed was wrong. Germany is not superior. We were defeated because our system was inferior. America is not weak. It is stronger than we imagined possible. Democracy is not decadent. It is more effective than dictatorship. I don't know what Germany I will find, what role I can play in rebuilding. But I know I will never again believe in the ideology that destroyed my country. If I can help build a democratic Germany, that will be some redemption for the years I wasted serving evil. Weber returned to Germany in early 1946, to a homeland that was physically and psychologically devastated. German cities were ruins, the economy was collapsed, the population was traumatized and demoralized. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Germany while American, British, and French forces held the West. The country was divided, occupied, its future uncertain. But Weber and thousands of other former POWs who had experienced transformation in American captivity became part of the foundation for democratic reconstruction. They joined with German anti-Nazi resistance members, with returning emigrants, with pragmatic Germans who accepted that the old ways had failed and new approaches were necessary. In Weber's case, he became a teacher, using his education and war experience to teach history and civics to German students in the American occupation zone. His goal, as he wrote in a letter to his former American captors, was to ensure that German children learn the truth about Nazism and democracy so that the mistakes of my generation are never repeated. Thousands of other former POWs played similar roles: teachers, local officials, business leaders, ordinary citizens who advocated for democracy in their communities. They were assisted by occupation authorities, but weren't imposed from above. They were Germans, speaking to other Germans, sharing experiences of having lived in America and seen that democracy worked. The impact of these 371 Sadie former POWs on German Reconstruction is impossible to measure precisely, but it was significant. They represented a substantial cohort of German men who had direct experience with American democracy, who could testify, from personal observation, that the American system produced better results than Nazism had. Their voices carried weight precisely because they were Germans who had fought for Germany, not collaborators or traitors, but soldiers who had done their duty and then learned from defeat. The broader program of democratic reconstruction in West Germany succeeded remarkably. By the 1950s, West Germany had become a stable democracy with a growing economy. The German economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s transformed West Germany from devastated war zone to European economic powerhouse. Democratic institutions took root and flourished. The militaristic nationalism that had characterized Germany for decades was replaced by commitment to democracy and European integration. Many factors contributed to this success: Marshall Plan aid, wise occupation policies, exhaustion with militarism after catastrophic defeat, Cold War dynamics that made Western commitment to German recovery strategic necessity. But the transformation of German attitudes, the rejection of Nazi ideology and acceptance of democratic values was fundamental to success. The POW re-education program contributed to this transformation. The hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who experienced American life during captivity, who saw American abundance and freedom firsthand, who came to question or reject the Nazi ideology they had been taught, returned to Germany with attitudes that supported rather than resisted democratic reconstruction. The program demonstrated that psychological transformation was possible even for adults who had been deeply indoctrinated. The key was not propaganda or coercion, but exposure to contradictory evidence that accumulated until cognitive dissonance forced reconsideration of beliefs. Seeing American industrial production that exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude, seeing American farms that were larger and more productive than German estates, seeing American workers living better than German aristocrats, these observations couldn't be explained within Nazi ideology and eventually forced its rejection. The program also demonstrated the soft power advantages of abundance. America didn't defeat Nazi ideology primarily through argument or propaganda. America defeated it by demonstrating that democratic capitalism produced better results than fascist state control. The lesson wasn't, "You should believe what we believe." It was, "Look at what our system produces compared to yours." This lesson remained relevant long after World War II ended. During the Cold War, America's ability to demonstrate superior living standards, greater prosperity, and more personal freedom became a crucial advantage against Soviet communism. The contrast between West and East Germany, between democratic capitalism and communist control, was particularly stark and particularly effective at undermining communist ideology. The seeds of that contrast were planted during World War II, when German POWs experienced American abundance firsthand and returned home to testify that the American system worked better than totalitarian alternatives. The arsenal of democracy defeated Nazism first militarily, through overwhelming production that supplied Allied forces faster than Axis forces could resist. But it also defeated Nazism ideologically, by demonstrating to hundreds of thousands of Germans that democracy and capitalism produced results that totalitarianism couldn't match. The story of German POWs in America is one of World War II's most important but often overlooked aspects. It reveals that winning wars isn't just about destroying enemy forces militarily, but also about winning psychological victories that transform enemies into allies. America's treatment of German prisoners, the exposure to American life that captivity provided, and the formal re-education program that built on that exposure all contributed to transforming defeated enemies into supporters of democracy. Friedrich Weber's story exemplifies this transformation. He came to America as a Nazi officer, committed to German victory and superior German culture. He left as a Democrat, committed to building a peaceful Germany integrated with Western democracies. His transformation wasn't imposed through force or achieved through clever propaganda. It was the result of cumulative evidence, observation after observation, that forced him to reconsider beliefs that couldn't survive contact with reality. Weber lived until 1992, long enough to see German reunification and the final end of World War II's divisions. He remained a teacher throughout his career, educating German students about democracy and the dangers of totalitarianism. He maintained correspondence with Americans he had met during captivity, including Mr. Peterson, the Kansas farmer who had employed him and shown him kindness. In a letter written in 1985, on the 40th anniversary of Germany's surrender, Weber reflected on his experiences. 40 years ago, everything I believed was proven wrong. Germany had been defeated, the Reich destroyed, my ideology shattered. At the time, I thought my life was over, that I had wasted my years serving evil. But from the ruins, something better was built. Germany is now a democracy, prosperous and peaceful, integrated with Europe, allied with America. I helped build this in my small way, teaching students and supporting democratic values. My time as a prisoner in America, which I feared at the time, was actually when I learned the lessons that enabled me to contribute to rebuilding Germany. The arsenal of democracy didn't just defeat Nazi armies, it showed us a better way to live. For that, I remain grateful. Weber's gratitude was echoed by thousands of other former POWs who experienced similar transformations. Their stories, individually small, collectively significant, demonstrate that America's greatest World War II victory wasn't won at Normandy or in the Battle of the Bulge. It was won in POW camps across America, where German prisoners encountered abundance that shattered their ideology, where they learned through direct observation that democracy worked better than dictatorship, where they were transformed from enemies into allies who would help build the peaceful, democratic Germany that emerged from the ruins. The arsenal of democracy produced tanks and planes and ships that won the military victory. But it also produced a psychological victory, demonstrating to hundreds of thousands of Germans that the American system of freedom, capitalism, and democracy produced results that totalitarianism couldn't match. That psychological victory, achieved not through force but through example, not through propaganda but through abundance, was as important to the post-war peace as any battlefield triumph. In the end, America defeated Nazi ideology not by proving that Americans were better people or that democracy was abstractly superior, but by demonstrating concretely that free societies could outproduce, outbuild, and outperform totalitarian ones. The lesson was learned by German prisoners who saw it with their own eyes, who returned home to testify to what they had witnessed, who helped build a democratic Germany that has now thrived for over 75 years. That is the untold story of how 371 German POWs experienced transformation that changed not just themselves but the future of Germany and Europe. The story of how the arsenal of democracy won its greatest victory, not through weapons, but through abundance, not through force, but through example, not by destroying enemies, but by transforming them into allies. The story of how America, by simply being itself, productive, abundant, free, broke the minds of those who had been taught to believe in systems that promised much but delivered destruction, and in doing so, helped create the foundation for lasting peace and democratic prosperity in post-war Europe.